And I will send a link to the recording and the slides in the next couple of days in case you'd like to see them or click on any of the links in the slides. So welcome. If you have any comments or questions, please feel free to type them in the chat at any time, and I will answer them as I can, or you are also free to unmute yourself and ask over your microphone. So good afternoon, and thank you for joining me for today's webinar on grant writing for members. The session will last for about 45 minutes, and then there will be time at the end for questions. But as I said, if you prefer to ask questions as we go along, please type them in the chat box. Now, before we dig in, I'm going to take a poll to see how many of the people in the audience today are veterans of grant writing or are new to the process. So I'm going to launch the poll. Hopefully you'll see that on your screen. And if you would just answer the question, have you worked on a grant application before? Yes or no? And this will just help give me a little understanding on if folks are brand new to it or have some experience. Oh, great. It's pretty evenly split. Got some folks who have worked on it before and some who haven't. Great. Thanks, everybody. And you can see the results there. This is the first time I've used a poll in Zoom, so I'm excited to test that out. Thank you. And thank you. You have once, Julie from Genesee. Great. All right. So my name again is Keturah Cappadonia, and I've been the outreach consultant at STLS for 5 years. Prior to that, I worked as a children's librarian and as the director of a small rural public library. I've written several grant applications. Some were successful and some were definitely not successful. I've also served as a reviewer for grants offered by the ALA, the National Library of Medicine, and the Arts Council of the Southern Tier. And in my job, I assist STLS members with all aspects of grant writing. And my cat Gordy, you can see on the screen, is my most helpful assistant. Although I'm at the office today, so he's not here, but he's working hard at home, I'm sure. So topics we will cover today include an overview of grant writing, locating data, locating funding sources, and some tips for success. If there are any aspects of grant writing that I don't touch on today and that you would like to learn more about, please email me or drop a note in the chat and let me know so that I can plan future workshops or individual consultations, which will help you better. Grant writing is a huge subject and we can't cover it all in an hour. So I would be happy to know what aspects of grant writing you might like some more additional help in. So let's start. What is a grant and how can it help my library? A grant is financial support given to nonprofits by corporations, foundations, organizations, or government agencies. Grant funds do not need to be repaid. Grants require a complete cycle of work, including pre-grant work, such as the application and planning for the project, implementation of the grant, and then reporting and evaluation of your project. So there is a lot more to doing grant work than just submitting an application. And it's always important to remember that when you get started working on a grant and you're really excited, just keep in mind there will be a bunch of work ahead of you. How do grants work? A grant is one part of a well-balanced basket of revenue streams for an organization. Grants provide funding for projects that increase awareness of your organization. Grants work with tax revenue, gifts and bequests, fundraising, and investments to help fund nonprofit organizations. And a grant can help bring publicity to your library and is often a source of community pride. That's not a small thing. As we know, we live in small communities, and we always love to see our organizations thrive and do well. So if you can get some publicity when you get a grant award, I think that really goes a long way in having a positive impact in the community. And if you can demonstrate to your community the good work your library is doing, you're going to reap more benefits, such as more yes votes when you have funding referendums. More people will know that you're a thriving organization, so they'll feel comfortable making donations and working with you in partnership. And then just remember again, a grant is not fast and easy money. It involves a lot of work during the planning, implementation, and reporting stages. I'll just pause to say welcome to anyone who has joined us just in the last few minutes. I am recording this presentation, so if you missed the first couple of slides, you can watch them later. So moving on, some reminders. A grant, while really nice, is not and should not be a major part of your library's finances, and they cannot be relied upon for long-term or repeated funding. Many experts in the field agree that a healthy nonprofit should never depend on grant funding for more than 30% of its total operating budget. And a grant, you may apply for the same grant in subsequent years. And although you get it one year, you may not get it the next year because grants are competitive and there are other organizations doing excellent work. So try not to rely on that grant to sustain projects for the long term. A grant is not a sustainable funding source. Most grants available to libraries fund projects for a specific period of time, and they are rarely able to be used for operating costs. Applying for and accepting grant funds is similar to your library signing a contract. Your library is stating in writing what they will do with the money that they receive through the grant, and your library is obligated to spend the funds and do the work as written in your application. Unless you specifically contact the funder if there are certain changes you need to make, you should proceed implementing the grant exactly as you wrote in your application. Not fulfilling grant obligations can jeopardize a library's eligibility for future funding and give your library a bad reputation. So let's talk about 4 types of grants. The first is a project grant. The majority of grant opportunities for libraries are project grants. These grants can help your library support a specific program or a project for a predetermined period of time. This may be a grant to fund a summer reading program or a series of cultural events such as music concerts. That project will end and the funding will end. A capacity building grant can enable your library to do more in a particular area. These grants fund a process rather than a project. They develop competencies, strategies, systems, and structures in order to improve organizational effectiveness. These capacity building grant activities strengthen an organization to grow its impact and accomplish its mission and goals. And we've seen a few of these capacity building grant opportunities in the last year or two as a result of a lot of the changes due to COVID. 2 other types of grant funds. One is operating fund grants. These are not plentiful. They help provide operating expenses. They're highly sought, but are extremely rare to find. We did, again, see a few of these come up as opportunities within the last year or two after COVID, but they're sort of the unicorn of grant opportunities. In-kind grants can provide non-monetary supplies such as books or equipment or personnel support. These grants are sometimes available to libraries to provide books or other library materials. I know a lot of our members have received the Pilcrow Foundation for Rural Libraries grants. That's what you would say is an in-kind grant. So they send you books for your children's book collection. What are grants about? Grants are not about money. They are not about your organization and a giant check and publicity photo. Grants are about people, the people in your community. Grants are about locating a need that exists in your community for programs and services, and then filling that need. Okay, that sounds good. How do we learn what people want and need? A few different ways we can do this. We can look at focus group data if you have such, or if you have done strategic planning, you probably have some survey feedback that you can use to see what people are interested in. You can do a community needs assessment and determine what organizations and services exist in your community and where there are gaps that you could help fill. Have conversations with other leaders in your community. These can be folks who lead other nonprofits, elected officials, educators, your trustees, certainly volunteers. Have conversations with them to learn what they are doing and where there might be opportunities for collaboration, or if they've noticed any gaps and needs that your library could help fill. And then finally, but not the least important, are statistics about your community. So this is a diagram I use. This has been passed down to me from Margot Gastina, if you remember her. On one side, we have the example of a traditional grant cycle. And then on the other side, we have the more effective cycle. The element that we have added is the box that says engage with community. So rather than working in a silo alone in your library to think of an idea that you want to provide funding for, you need to first engage with your community. It can be easy to leave the community out of the grant planning process. It is tempting to just run with an idea you think would be great for your library. However, a grant-funded project can be more successful if you engage with the community to learn what your library can offer to fill the gaps, as we just touched on. It is important to engage with other organizations to learn what they're doing. Could you partner with them on an existing project? Could they partner with you on your grant project? How can you leverage more support for your project to ensure its success? Engagement with the community and with grant funders is key to the grant writing process. Here is a pro tip from STLS Executive Director Brian Hildreth, who has written and implemented numerous grant projects over several years. His pro tip: create a relationship with the funder. And a quote from Brian here: creating relationships with funders are also key. Getting to know these people, even if it is not grant related, is so important. They will take care of you when you need their help, and you can help them when they need something from your organization. So as Brian said in that tip, getting to know them, even if you're not currently working on a grant project, is important, so that when you do have an opportunity arise, you can reconnect with them. They'll know your name, they'll know your face, and you can work together. This fits into what I call the 3 R's of grant writing: research, relationships, and writing. So although I call this workshop grant writing for members, there's really a lot more, which involves the research and relationships. So before you get started doing the work of a grant application, conduct an initial assessment. Ask yourself these questions before you start. Take a look at the schedule. When is the grant application due? And then when is the funding period for the project? Does that timeline work for your library? Think about things that might be happening. Are you going to be undergoing a renovation project? Will you have a staff member taking medical leave during that time? Will it be summer reading when you're busy doing other programs? So take a look at that timeline and make sure it works for your organization. The mission, what is the point of this funding project, and does it fit with your library's mission? Take a look at the budget. Will the funding be reimbursable or will it be upfront? And when I use those terms, I mean reimbursable funding means that your library will be asked to foot the bill and then submit receipts to be reimbursed for your expenses. So for some libraries who have maybe more substantial savings, that could work. But for other libraries on smaller budgets, that might create a lot of difficulty and they might not be able to cover that funding. So they may want to look for grants who only provide upfront funding, where the funder sends you the check at the beginning of the grant period or sends you a portion. Sometimes it's 80%, and then they send you the rest at the conclusion of your project. So just take a look at that before you get started, because that could make a difference. And then risk, so perceived competition for funds. As you can imagine, national grant opportunities will probably have a lot more competition than some local and state grants. Keep that in mind. Is it worth your organization's time and efforts to apply for a grant that you have a smaller chance of getting? That's a decision you can make. Eligibility. Always make sure that your organization meets the criteria that the funders are looking for. Is your organization the right size? Does it serve the right population? Is it for a rural library? Are you far enough away from the city? Is it for an urban library, etc.? Always take a look at that. Sustainability. Think about what you will do when the grant funding period ends. We'll talk a little bit more about this in a few minutes, but how will you sustain a program if it's highly successful after that grant funding ends? What will you do? So take a few minutes to think about that. And then capacity. Can our staff do this work in addition to their normal responsibilities? So if you do get a grant project funded, your staff will not be able to stop doing their normal tasks. They will instead be taking on a new project in addition to their normal tasks. So is that feasible? Are there ways to work around that and make sure that staff do not get stressed or overworked or work more hours than they're scheduled? Just some things to think about before you even begin writing that application. So SMART. SMART is an acronym to keep in mind when you're writing a grant application. And you may have heard me say this before. SMART stands for specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-based. So any project that you're applying for funds for, you want to make sure meets all these goals. It should be measurable. You should be able to evaluate the success. It should be attainable. It should be something that your library will be able to achieve in a good way. It should be relevant to your library's mission and your services, and time-based, because grant projects do end. Project plans which don't demonstrate SMART goals are less likely to receive funding. So here I just have a sample call for grant proposals that I created last year. Just for those of you who may not have worked on a grant application before, I just want to point out a few highlights, and I will include a link to this document when I send out the slides. So as I say here, note the priority categories. So in this document, they are, oh, sorry about that. They are asking for literacy programs to develop skills in the areas of digital literacy, financial literacy, media literacy, data literacy, or reading and writing for all ages. So that's something you want to take a look at. Make sure your program will fit with that. Note what programs will be funded. So they're looking for programs that develop skills and capacities of children and teens. Note the deadline. Check out when this grant is due. Check out, also I include on here the time. So this would be a grant application that you would submit electronically, which is how most grant applications are done now. But when you see that deadline, you want to create a timeline and work backwards. So if the deadline is August 31st, you want to have a final draft done about a week in advance at least. So then you can move backwards and determine when you need to start, when you need to have your first draft. And so you will be ready to submit that on August 31st. And then you can note the amount that will be requested. So this one funds projects for $500 to $5,000, and funds are distributed via reimbursement after grant completion. So as I said before, make sure that that would work for your organization. Again, I'll include a link to this document, and I'll also give you a link to the application form for this grant and a scoring rubric. So you can take a look at how grants are reviewed as well. So let's talk about evaluation. This is a question you will see in grant applications. Your plan to evaluate your project. So there are two reasons evaluation of nonprofit programs is so necessary. First, and perhaps the most important reason, is that evaluation helps your programs. It gives your organization critical feedback that tells you if it works, how well it works, and how to improve it. Without any form of evaluation, you're really flying blind. So secondly, funders require evaluation. So every funder, whether it's a foundation, a corporation, or a government agency, wants to know if the project they funded worked or not. They want to know what the return on their investment is. So types of evaluation are quantitative, qualitative, or a combination of quantitative and qualitative. So quantitative methods measure or count data. They answer questions such as how much, using statistical analysis, such as averages, means, percentiles. So you want to use quantitative methods for issues that involve understanding quantities or frequency, determining cause and effect, comparing different things, and establishing numerical baselines. Qualitative methods use direct or indirect contact with people. They can consist of interviews, observation, surveys, review of relevant documents. Qualitative methods can be more difficult to ascertain, but they can be very useful for studying processes and feedback, but they don't measure like quantitative data does. So qualitative methods can be used to understand feelings or opinions of people, to gain insight into relationships or patterns, to identify approximate rather than exact information. So there's also the combination where you can do a little bit of both. This is an ideal way to evaluate projects using both data and with contact with people. So qualitative methods include interviews, focus groups, observations, surveys, questionnaires, or exit slips with space for open-ended answers. And these can be very simple, from just giving everyone a Post-it note when they leave the room and asking them to write one word about the program on it and then stick the Post-it note on the wall. That's a really low-level, easy thing to do. Or you can do more in-depth interviews or a survey to ask people more follow-up questions. And then our quantitative methods, they can include door counts, reservations for programs, circulation statistics, database or website hits, social media stats, surveys or questionnaires where people rank or pick from predetermined choices. And you can also talk about how many new library cards were issued during a certain program, or the number of events that were attended. So these methods of evaluation are important when you're doing grant work, as I said, to demonstrate to the funder why, how their money was used, and also to help your organization evaluate whether you want to try this sort of program again or work on ways to improve it. Sustainability. So this, again, is a question we see on applications a lot. How will your organization sustain a program or a service after the grant funding period ends? So funders want your organization to succeed long after their investment ends. They don't want to do like a one and done kind of funding. So be sure your organization or program description demonstrates sustainable fiscal capacity and self-sufficiency. So if you're using some other funds to help with the grant project, be sure to list them. If that's, things your library already has or a donation from a friends group, make sure that's listed on the application. You want to show as an organization that you'll be accountable for ensuring the continuation of a project. So you can also look at a few ways to do that in-house, such as phase in small participation fees over time, such as a materials fee if you're doing a craft program or an arts program. You'll also want to work with your trustees and look at phasing in new allocations of budgets moving forward once success is established. So you could maybe divert money from one budget category to sustain more program funding. And again, as I said earlier, the publicity, the good feelings that come from grant projects can also help go a long way when it's time to work on a funding referendum, because people will have seen positive news about your organization and they may be won over to help provide more funding for your organization. This can be a slow but steady move. You can also leverage success into more partnerships to help with cost efficiencies moving forward. So working with another organization, sharing staff on some of these projects can be a helpful way to sustain funding. And then you can look at other ways that don't necessarily involve money, but are strategies for sustainability, such as staff time. So perhaps you have a staff member who is assigned 10 hours a week to work at the circulation desk. Is there a way that you could reallocate some of their time, and maybe 2 hours of their work week will be spent on programs, and you can shift the workload around to accommodate the new programs without paying for more staff hours. But always be sure to be clear about what might be phased out to make room for anticipated new programs. And then change the culture moving forward. So if the proposed project includes training, then the years of that project can start building the new habit of continuous learning, swapping of ideas that costs little to sustain over time. And you can consider phasing in volunteers or interns to do some of the work that might have been done by staff in the past, if those staff are now working on grant-funded projects that you want to sustain. So as you begin working in grants, you want to think about creating a document library. This helps you get organized by putting documents together so that you can have them handy when it's time to apply for grants. This is especially great if you're going to be doing a lot of grant applications, or if you have various staff members and trustees who are going to be working on grants. They'll all know where these documents are kept in a centralized location. So I've got a list there on the screen of some documents you probably will want to keep handy. Some of these documents you might have to hunt around for. You might have to ask your accountant or your treasurer. So having them ready in advance will just make the process a little bit easier. Some other numbers you might also want to keep handy include the number of registered library card holders, the number of programs and attendees from your previous year, and circulation numbers. So maybe keeping a copy of your most recent annual report, annual statistical report handy would also be beneficial. And as I said before, try to keep these in a centralized location. So when I first started writing grants, I just used a file folder and it was in my desk, and my staff knew where it was, the trustees knew, everybody could find it that way. Nowadays, there are other options. You might consider cloud storage, such as in Google Drive, or if you have an internal drive at your library, you might want to keep these materials there, but just having them where other folks can see them. So one thing you also want to maybe think about building at the beginning, and something you can use repeatedly, is a community profile. So oftentimes grant applications will limit the number of characters you use. So I suggest trying to write a small profile to begin with, 400 words or less, and briefly describe the geographic location and composition of the population your organization serves. Most importantly, do not assume funders know your community. So for local organizations, when we apply for grants, yeah, they may know where your library is and what your community is like. But if you're applying to a state organization or national organization, they just may not have any familiarity with your community. So try to create a successful narrative that helps a reader envision your community, to have context upon which to envision the proposed funded project. Use a combination of descriptive language, relevant statistics, cultural social heritage, major employers or industries, socioeconomic shifts, or other details that help your community spring to life in the minds of grant reviewers. If you're feeling stumped, you might consider contacting your local Chamber of Commerce, Visitors Bureau, or Tourism Bureau to see how they describe your community. You can look on their website as well, because they usually want to paint your area in the best light to get people to come visit. And they may use language that you can borrow, and really make your community shine. So what are funders looking for when they review your grant applications? The review process is usually done by a team of reviewers. So best practice is not for one person to review and make funding decisions, but for a team of folks to review and make the decisions jointly. So when you are writing your application, just keep in mind that multiple people will probably be reading it. They want to see a clear need for your program or service. They want to know what's in it for them. Will they get some good publicity out of it? They want to know your organization is reliable and has a good reputation. They want to see some demonstrated proof of how this project will impact your community. And they want to see evidence that your program can be sustained and you will not be writing to them again next year asking for more money. They want you to succeed in the long term. So be sure your program description demonstrates sustainable fiscal capacity and self-sufficiency. List other funding sources if you have them. So if you have any local partners, or you're using in-kind funds such as library staff, resources, list those. If you have completed other grant projects, you can list those to demonstrate your ability to successfully implement grants. Brag about your library. Don't be shy. I see a lot of libraries who think the things they do aren't any big deal, but they really are. They are a big deal. You're making a lot of positive impacts. So definitely brag about that. Data, looking at data. Why is data important on a grant application? Increasingly, funders want to see there is evidence to prove that what you're applying for is needed in the community or location where you are applying. So how can you prove this? There are a few different ways when you use data. You can look at national statistics or state statistics and see if your area performs above or below a national or state average. You can use any quantitative or qualitative surveys that you've implemented in your community to see what residents say. And in order to demonstrate the extent of the need, it is often useful to cite statistics from a recognized source. So this involves some homework. And we'll take a look at some data sources. The data should demonstrate the needs of your community. It should be descriptive and it should show pockets of need. So you could write in your grant application, quote, "We have many poor families in our community," end quote. Or using data you found in the census, you could say 24% of families in Gordytown are living under the poverty rate, which is higher than the New York State average of 15.1% of families. So which of those statements do you think would make a stronger impact? Probably the one that has concrete numbers that demonstrate just how much of a need or how much of a need there is to serve people who have lower incomes. Other data types you can include, depending on what your project is going to target. You could talk about the average age of your population density, or the distance from a city or urban area. You could talk about the presence or absence of public transportation, the unemployment rate, education levels in your community, and as I said, the percentage living in poverty. So these can be ways to show funders why your community needs their money. So some sources for data that myself and my colleagues use often include the Esri Tapestry data, New York State Quick, and the Kids Count Data Center. Those two sources provide data specifically on children. And for New York State Quick, it's children in New York State. So if you're doing any applying for a program to fund programs for children, those are helpful sources. The census data, as I already mentioned, so we've got fresh 2020 data there that you can look at. If you want to talk about any employment rates or unemployment rates, you can use the New York State Department of Labor website. They have statistics. And then if you're talking about a project that might have implications for improving community health, you can look at statistics through the New York State Health Department. And then each county is required to complete a community health improvement project called a CHIP every couple of years. So, and they do put that on their website, and that includes a lot of data about local health statistics, which can be helpful. And when I send out the slides, you will have links to all of those sites and you can take a look. If you plan to apply for grants often on a regular basis, you might want to consider creating a data sheet to keep your stats in a handy all-in-one space. So on the screen here, I have a shot of a statistics spreadsheet I use for the STLS service area, where you can see the categories I have there, and then the numbers, And then over on the right-hand side, I have the state average. So this is a quick and easy way for me to compare our STLS counties with state averages if I want to do that. And I'll also put a link to this when I send out documentations if you'd like to use this as a model or use the data that I have collected. So funding sources. This is a question I get asked a lot. Where can I find funding sources? So I am going to put a link in the chat, which includes to our STLS. I have a grant writing and funding LibGuide where I include some of these sources. And then I send out a monthly newsletter during the first week of each month called Reaching Out. And that covers topics on outreach and adult services. And I always include some current grant opportunities there. If you're not receiving that newsletter but would like to, please feel free to put your email address in the chat and I will add you to the list. And then other places you can find grant opportunities include a lot of listservs from professional organizations such as Nyline, ALA, PLA, and then other folks here at STLS send out grant opportunities when they see them as well. I'll just touch on a few here. So federal funding sources, we've got the IMLS, the National Library of Medicine, National Endowment for the Arts, and the National Endowment for Humanities are a few. Keep in mind that national grant opportunities are extremely competitive because they're accepting applications from all over the country, but certainly are worth taking a look at. Again, the links to the sites will be in the slides. In New York State, some funding sources. Humanities New York, they provide a couple of different grant opportunities, action grants, vision grants, and quick grants. And these are usually intended to fund humanities type programs. I know some of our libraries have worked with them on some book club programs for adults and some cultural performances. That is the New York State Program for Conservation and Preservation of Library Research Materials. So that provides state funding for organizations engaged in efforts to preserve deteriorating library research materials, and the state aid for library construction, which comes up each year. I will put a link to our information about that is on our website if you have questions about that. And then our regional funding sources. These are extremely generous and helpful for our libraries, and probably some of you have received funding through them. So community foundations, for our area, there are a couple that serve our region. For Allegheny County, they have the Allegheny County Area Foundation, and then the Community Foundation of Elmira, Corning, and the Finger Lakes. Both have some great opportunities. Arts councils, so every county in New York State is covered by an arts council, which provides decentralization funding. So locally, we have three. Arts Council of the Southern Finger Lakes covers Chemung, Steuben, Schuyler, and then Arts Council for Wyoming County covers Allegheny County, and Auburn Public Theater covers Yates County. So they have annual grant programs. STLS, we have the Foundation for Southern Tier Libraries, and we have our COSAC Outreach Mini Grants. Both of those are annual programs. And then there may be other charitable foundations which you are aware of locally. And then there are some grant opportunities offered by professional organizations, including ALA, YALSA, PLA, ARSL. A note on these is that sometimes you need to be a member to apply. Sometimes you don't. It depends on the different opportunities. Corporations and businesses. So Dollar General annually has literacy fund grants. If you live near some stores such as Walmart, Target, or Home Depot, they usually offer some funding for community organizations. You would want to check with them. And then there are some national foundations, such as the Ezra Jack Keats Foundation, Autism Welcome Here, the Pilcrow Foundation, which award funds. And again, I try to keep a list of those on my STLS grants LibGuide, so you can take a look there. Partners. So why do we need partners when we're doing grant work? Funders want to see collaborations in your grant applications because they often lead to better results. Collaboration can be extremely powerful. Some grant applications now require you to have a partnership with at least one other source. So take a look in the application to see if you need to do that. Projects with partnerships have a higher success rate, and they increase the likelihood the project will have a larger impact. And this helps reassure a funder that they're getting the most bang for their buck. So possible partners in your community, these could be organizations you're already doing work with on other projects. Find out what's going on with these organizations. Sign up to receive their newsletters, attend meetings if they have meetings that are open to other members of the public. Join the Rotary Club, the Lions Club, and just talk to these folks and see what's going on with their organization to get some conversation started about collaboration on projects. And I just put a list here of some organizations. I know not all communities have all of these, but you probably have at least one or two that you could work with. So before we wrap it up, I'll just give you a few final reminders to keep in mind. Follow specific application instructions. Read through the application instructions once or twice. Make sure you know what you're expected to put in that application. Always meet deadlines. Include a realistic budget. So make sure you're getting quotes on prices, not just guessing how much something will cost. Submit proposals which demonstrate thoughtful planning. So a funder, a grant reviewer can tell when you've spent some time writing your grant application, or if you just slapped it together the night before it was due. Make sure your project meets the purpose of the grant. Try to echo in your application the language from the grant guidelines, and avoid things like jargon, library jargon, such as the word like circ as an abbreviation for circulation, or ILL instead of interlibrary loan. Make sure that you're using proper grammar and good sentence construction. Always try to have at least 2 other people proofread your application before you submit it, because you've probably looked at that application several times. Having some fresh eyes take a look will be beneficial. And then communicate with the funders before you submit. Try to touch base with them. Picking up the phone is awesome because you're making an impact when you talk to someone, and not just send them an email. But if email is all that's available, do that. If they see your name or hear your voice, they're more apt to think about you when they see the pile of applications that come in. A few common mistakes that you might want to avoid. You didn't tailor your ask. So maybe there's a certain project you really want to get funded and you keep trying different grant opportunities without tailoring that request to their guidelines. That can be problematic. Shoehorning, which is very similar, which is you just want to get a certain project funded, but it may not meet the guidelines for the funding opportunity. maybe you missed a deadline, or that's never a good luck. Maybe you were a stranger, you didn't make any initial contact with that funder, so they didn't consider you above or beyond anyone else. Sloppiness, lack of effort, hyperbole and jargon. Those are just, some writing stylistic issues, and then budget errors. Please make sure that your budget adds up correctly, that it meets the guidelines for what the funder is offering, because I have seen some grant applications with budget errors just rejected out of hand, by some organizations. So be careful on that. Some resources you might find helpful when working on grant writing projects. I just included there some links. And again, you'll get get the slides and it will have the hyperlinks. WebJunction has a lot of helpful articles and recordings of webinars that are all designed for libraries, so check that out. Candid used to be called the Foundation Center, so if you've worked with them before, you'll now want to take a look at the Candid site. All right, we are done. So I will ask if you have any questions. Also, I'm checking the chat box to see something here. Kelly says she recently discovered Internet as infrastructure for digital stats, broadband information. I haven't explored it much, but the webinar had a lot of info she can forward. You do need to register, but it is free. Cool, Kelly, thank you for that. I do have
a question. Oh, I have a question.
Sure.
So one of the things I struggle with most is the evaluations. And I'm wondering if you have any suggestions, like how do you get people to fill them out? I think of like summer learning program is the one I've had the most issues with getting feedback on, like from parents. So I'm gonna try both this year, both like a digital, like an email survey, but also like in-person evaluations. I find them just really hard to collect.
Sure. Yeah, I totally understand that, especially when you've got parents who are rushing to, get the kids off to swimming lessons, et cetera, go feed them. Yeah, so anything as simple like I shared that Post-it idea where, they can write one word. Maybe even writing it down would take too much time. So just ask them if you have someone who can help you collect, just ask the question, raise your hand and tell me one good thing about our program today. If you have someone who can record that data, either, verbally or in paper, that is a helpful way to do it. Let's see, you can ask even the kids. You could, I guess if you want the parents, that's a little different, but you could make it an activity for the kids where, you say, color a picture of what we did today and bring it back to the library, and I don't want to bribe them, but you can get a piece of candy or something like that. Even a child's drawing could be a type of evaluation where you could see what they took away from that program. Maybe if we could think of a way to see like interaction that the parents have with each other. Maybe say like, did you tell anybody else about this program? Or did you recommend the library on social media? I know we can't see what they do on social media, but sometimes something as simple as like a share of a post or a picture from a program, where they say, hey, this was so much fun, that could help you get some insight into how they felt about the program and what they took away, if that's helpful. But we can definitely talk more about that too. We'll make a note to think about that some more. Does anyone else have any questions or any information you'd like to share? Okay, well, thank you, everybody. I hope I didn't put you to sleep. As I said, I will send you an email in the next couple of days to follow up, and it will have the slides from today's presentation and a link to the recording that we did. In the meantime, if you think of a question or you'd like to talk with me about grant writing, something we didn't touch on today, please feel free to email me. And my email address is on the screen there, cappadoniak@STLS. I'm also going to put a link in the chat. If you have not yet taken it, STLS is currently conducting our 2022 learning survey because we'd really like to know what our members want to learn more about in future workshops. So if you haven't done it yet, I would just ask you to click on that link. If you've already done it, maybe share that link with someone else in your organization and ask them to fill it out, because we want to make sure we're helping give you information that you want and need. So with that, I'll say thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful afternoon, and I'll talk to you soon.
Thank you.
Thanks.